Okay, guys, so new ways of thinking. We're going to talk about laissez-faire economics, utilitarianism, and socialism. We're going to talk about where those were born in the Industrial Revolution and kind of get talking about that. All right, let's move some things around here, okay? So the first thinker on here that we need to gather up is Adam Smith and his idea of laissez-faire, and what laissez-faire means. So we're going to go into the reading. Everywhere in Britain, economist Malthus saw population, blah, blah, blah. Laissez-faire economics. During the Enlightenment, remember we're calling way back to an earlier unit. During the Enlightenment, physiocrats, that is the philosophe who talked about the economy, right? They argued that natural laws should be allowed to operate without interference. As part of this philosophy, they thought the government should not interfere in the free operation of the economy. Okay. In the early 1800s, middle-class business leaders embraced this laissez-faire or hands-off approach. So laissez-faire it's a French term. It means let it be or hands off, leave it alone. And in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith talked a lot about this. He said that a free market would help everyone, not just the rich. He said it would cause people to compete and produce goods at the lowest price without waste, and that if you let everybody look after their own good, then everyone's own good will be best served. Okay, that's sort of the gist of what he was saying. In other words, they believe the government should not interfere in the economy. That is not the document I meant to open. They thought that the government should not interfere in the economy. Back to Malthus. So up here, it talks about Malthus a little bit. Published an essay on the principle of population. He said poverty was unavoidable because the population was increasing faster than the food supply. Okay. The power of population is far greater than the power of the earth to produce subsistence, that is, food for man. Okay. He was trying to grapple with how can we feed everybody if every time we feed people, they continue to populate until they're starving. And that's kind of the way he saw this. So down here, we can actually read about Malthus. It says he holds a bleak view. He was also a laissez-faire economist. He predicted the population would outpace the food supply. The only thing to stop the population from growing were war, disease, and famine. So he urged people to have fewer children. I must not have highlighted that. He said that the population would outpace the food supply, and that the only way to keep this from happening was war, so get people to kill each other, disease, or let people, die of cholera or COVID, right? And famine, or let them starve to death. Right? He said that was the only thing that kept the population from growing. And so that's kind of a cruel way to look at it, but it's also kind of true, right? That's what keeps people from just living forever and having more and more and more children. But he said that as long as the population kept increasing, the poor would suffer. And so he advised poor families to stop having so many kids. He said, if you can't afford to feed your kids, don't have more. This is where that idea came from. It came from a guy named Thomas Malthus. Okay? And he predicted kind of a population crisis. And sometimes we call this a Malthusian crisis, or Malthusian crisis. That's not going to be on your test, but if you ever hear someone say Malthusian crisis, they're talking about this idea that people will breed until they starve. Next, we have David Ricardo and his iron law of wages. First, we should note, during the early 1800s, many people accepted his view, his bleak view, as the factory system changed people's lifestyles for the worse. Okay. His view was proved wrong, however. The population boom did continue, but the food supply grew even faster. We had a revolution in agriculture called the Green Revolution, where suddenly we were able to produce crops much, much faster than we had been able to before. And the living conditions of people actually improved. There was plenty of food. So that was a thing. Ricardo, we're looking for his iron law of wages. Ricardo dedicated himself to economic studies after reading The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Like Malthus, he didn't hold out hope for the working class to escape poverty. Because he made such gloomy predictions, economics came to be known as the dismal science, or the kind of the depressing science. In his iron law of wages, Ricardo said that wage increases were futile. They were useless. There was no point raising wages because the increases would only cover the cost of necessities. He said that when wages are high, families would have more children instead of raising their standard of living. He said there's no point paying people more because then they'll just have more kids. They won't live better, they'll just have more kids. Okay? Both Malthus and Ricardo opposed the government helping the poor. In their view, the best cure for poverty was not the government relief, but the unrestricted laws of the free market. They thought that if people wanted to live better, that they had to live thrifty. Okay, they had to live thrifty, they had to work hard, and they had to limit the size of their family. So basically, self-discipline was the problem with poverty. That poor people just needed to have more self-discipline. I was a fairly poor person myself growing up. I have to say, it didn't feel like we lacked self-discipline. It didn't feel like that was the problem. But, maybe I'm wrong. So anyway, iron law of wages. Iron law of wages. Ricardo says that wage increases were futile. That raising people's wages would only make them have more children, and so more people would be poor. So raising wages actually increased the number of people who were miserable. That was kind of his viewpoint on that. And though I disagree, I do get that this makes some kind of sense. It is at least partly true. There's an idea in the animal world called carrying capacity, where animals will basically breed and breed and breed until they exhaust the resources available to them. And that's kind of where these ideas, is Malthusian crisis and iron law of wages, that's where these ideas come from. So there's some sense to them, but turns out they're still sort of cruel ideas. Next, we come to Jeremy Bentham and his utilitarianism. Other thinkers tried to modify laissez-faire to justify some government intervention. Jeremy Bentham advocated utilitarianism, the idea that the goal of society should be the greatest happiness for the greatest number of its citizens. That sounds a whole lot like Jean-Jacques Rousseau with his general will, right? So Bentham and Rousseau, they kind of had there was a thread of thought that follows through here from one philosophy to the other. But the idea that the role of government is to serve most of the people, or the will of most of the people. What benefits the most people is the most good. To Bentham, all laws or actions should be judged by their utility. In other words, their usefulness. Okay, utility means usefulness. How useful is this law to make more people happy? Do they provide more pleasure or pain? Bentham, though, he strongly supported individual freedom, where he thought that freedom was a guarantee for happiness. He said that if we restrict people as little as possible, but still making sure that the government becomes involved to make sure that people are less restricted, that's the best government. Okay, so it's kind of a middle ground between between laissez-faire and the socialism that we're going to get into, talk about here. Utilitarianism. It said that laws should be judged on how useful they are. Do they provide more? Do they make more people happy or more people miserable? And if they don't make more people happy, there shouldn't be a law. This gets us into, we kind of skipped in our assessment here. I didn't add this philosopher, John Stuart Mill, but we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill here in the reading really quick. Bentham's ideas influenced the British philosopher and economist John Stuart Mill. Although he believed strongly in individual freedom, Mill wanted the government to step in to improve the hard lives of the working class. He said the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So the only time, according to Mill, the only time the government can boss anyone around is if it is to prevent harm to others. But indeed, the government should prevent harm to others. And that's kind of the way he saw it. It's a very utilitarian approach. Okay, the government should just prevent people from harming each other, but that it should take an active role in doing that. But otherwise, it should stay out of people's faces. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. John Stuart Mill, by the way, I'm not giving him a fair shake here. He might be one of the most influential and important philosophers of this time period. It's just that our text doesn't cover him very well. And we have plenty to do here. We've got a lot of philosophy to look at here already, so we're not going to add to it. Next, we have Robert Owen and his utopianism or early socialism. And you'll notice that Owen's utopianism / socialism, and then we've got Marx and Engels' socialism / communism. So we have early socialism and later socialism. We're going to talk about sort of the transition here from one to the other. Utopianism, by the way, is not the term that Robert Owen used for his own approach to the economy. It's sort of a slanderous term that people use to sort of mock him or make fun of him. See, a utopia is a perfect world. That's what utopia means. It's Greek. It means perfect world or perfect society. And so they said, "Oh, you're going to go down there and form the perfect society, aren't you, Robert?" And that's kind of how they mocked him. So, but we're going to look at this. The poverty and filth of the industrial age did not sit well with Robert Owen. Like other where did we talk about utopians yet? Like other utopians, he believed there was a way he could change society for the better. To prove this point, he set up a cotton mill as a model village. He said that the conditions that people lived in shaped their character. He reduced the working hours, built homes for people, started a school for their children, opened a company store where workers could buy food and clothes. He showed that an employer could offer decent living and working conditions and run a profitable business. Between 1815 and 1825, about 20,000 people visited New Lanark to study Owen's reforms. 20,000. The complex fell into decline. It was just outcompeted. But visitors can still wander the village today. You can still go and visit New Lanark in Scotland. Socialist thought emerges. While the champions of laissez-faire economics praised individual rights, other people focused on the good of society in general. They condemned the evils of industrial capitalism, which they believed had created a gulf between the rich and the poor. To end poverty and injustice, they offered a radical solution: socialism. Under socialism, the people as a whole, rather than private individuals, would own and operate the means of production. Okay. So socialism grew out of the Enlightenment faith in the progress of human nature and its concern for social justice. It's that idea that the role of government is to serve most of the people. Okay, that's where it sort of emerges from. Are utopians dreamers, though? A number of early socialists, like Robert Owen, established communities where all the work was shared and all the property was held in common. When there was no difference between the rich and the poor, the fighting between people would disappear. Early socialists were called utopians. This name implied that they were impractical and dreamers. Okay? The idea that they were just dreaming of something amazing, that it wasn't something that could actually work. That's a big critique of socialism, is that it doesn't work. That if you have everybody share everything, that one selfish person can come and take advantage of that whole system. I won't weigh in on that. Utopianism. Oh. Socialism. It says that the people as a whole, rather than private individuals, will control the means of production. Like the farms, the factories, the railways, and the other large businesses. Okay. So if something gets made that people want, then the people should control what makes it, is kind of the idea of socialism. All right, so now we're going to get into later socialism. We're going to talk about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. These guys formulated what they called communism. It's an offshoot from socialism. It is a kind of socialism, right? But instead of focusing on how society can just share everything, Marx and Engels, they focus on how it's a struggle and how the poor, the working people who make everything, have fought against their bosses for forever, that's the way society has been. And so instead of focusing on how to share everything, they focus on how the workers should take everything and share it. The taking part, the war, the battle, the struggle is sort of their focus in this philosophy, by comparison. In the 1840s, Karl Marx, a German philosopher, he condemned the ideas of utopians as unrealistic idealism. So he said that they were being unrealistic. He formulated a new theory that he called scientific socialism. He said that this was based on his scientific study of history. He teamed up with another German socialist, Friedrich Engels, whose father owned a textile factory in England. Marx and Engels wrote a pamphlet called the Communist Manifesto. It was published in 1848. That is, 1848. So keep that in mind. That is 100 years before where a lot of its influence would influence Russia and the communist governments of the United Soviet Socialist Republic during the Cold War. So 100 years before the Cold War, they published the Communist Manifesto. They said a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. Marx predicted a struggle between social classes that would lead to a classless society, where all of the means of production would be owned by the community. In practice, however, communism later came to refer to a system where the government was led by a small elite that controlled all economic and political life. Meaning, so Marx's communism idea predicted that there would not be social classes. But when it was put into practice, it just concentrated power into the hands of even fewer people. So it was kind of a dream that wasn't realized here. It was railroaded by some people who sort of took advantage of it, I think. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx theorized that economics was the driving force in history. He said that history was the history of class struggles between the haves and the have-nots. The haves always owned the means of production and controlled society and all its wealth. In industrialized Europe, Marx said, the haves were the bourgeoisie, and the have-nots were the proletariat, or the working class. And according to Marx, this modern class struggle put the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. In the end, he predicted that the proletariat would be triumphant. After all, there were more working people than there were factory owners. Workers would take control of the means of production and set up a classless communist society. So Marx envisioned, the workers coming off of the shop floor and going upstairs to the offices and, kicking the bosses out and taking over the factories, okay, if not killing them. It got kind of violent in his imagination, I think. Such a society would mark the end of the struggles that people had endured throughout history, because wealth and power would finally be equally shared. Marx despised capitalism. He believed that it created prosperity for only a few people and poverty for very many. He called for an international struggle to bring about its downfall. Workers of all countries, he urged, unite. So he said that nations and the ideas of nations weren't as important as the struggle between the haves and the have-nots. We'll talk more about this in a second when we talk about Marxism in the future. Okay. So communism predicted a struggle between social classes where the proletariat would win. Okay, the workers would take over. They would take over. There's a little more here. Communism later came to refer to a system where the government was led by a small group, a new social class that was led by sort of the idea people. And they controlled all economic and political life. There was a problem with this, though. There was a problem with this. Okay. At first, Marxism gained popularity with many people around the world. Leaders of a number of reform movements adopted the idea that power should be held by workers rather than by business owners. Marx's ideas never were practiced exactly as he imagined. Of course, no idea ends up carried out in the real world. It's just not the way that goes. It does briefly flourish. German socialists adopted his ideas to form social democracy, an idea where there's a gradual transition from capitalism to socialism instead of a sudden, violent overthrow of the system. Okay. But many Marxists saw this as a betrayal of the violent overthrow that they thought was necessary. Later on, we'll read about how the Russians kind of handled this. In the late 1800s, Russian socialists embraced Marxism, and the Russian Revolution of 1917 set up a communist-inspired government. That Bolshevik revolution was very violent, and its purpose was basically kill all the people who own everything and give it to the people as a whole. But it didn't work. For much of the 1900s, revolutionaries around the world adapted Marxist ideas to their own situations and needs. Leaders in Asia, Latin America, and Africa turned to Marxism, but it did lose its appeal. As time passed, the failures of Marxist governments would illustrate the flaws in Marx's argument. He predicted that workers would unite across national borders to wage class warfare. Instead, though, nationalism won out over working class loyalty. In general, people felt stronger ties to their own countries, their own communities, than to this international communist movement. By the end of the 20th century, few nations remained with communist governments, while nearly every economy included elements of laissez-faire. So communism failed because people feel more loyalty to their own country than to the idea of workers uniting. Okay, in other words, People like us, we feel more loyalty to people who are American and embrace American ideas, like working hard and eating the foods we eat, speaking the languages we speak, than we do to the idea that, there are no countries and there's only the workers and the people that they work for. And so Marxism sort of flopped because of that. Let's look at our next question. What are laissez-faire economics? Well, we can steal this directly from the top up here, right? Laissez-faire economics are where the government doesn't interfere in the free operation of the economy. So really, we're just copying this again down here. But this puts it in a nice quiz-looking question, doesn't it? I can write this question on a quiz. The government shouldn't interfere with the economy. That's what laissez-faire means. How did Malthus think that we could keep the poor population from increasing? Basically, let them fall victim to the things that kill people, right? War, disease, and famine. Basically, if we want to keep the poor population from increasing, we need to stop doing welfare. Or he kind of imagined this before welfare was an idea, but he thought that giving money to poor people was just a way to make more poor people. Why did Ricardo think that wages should be kept low? Remember, he thought that when you raise wages, the poor just have more children. They just multiply. And this would cause it to be even more people who were unhappy. Here, this question is why I went ahead and went over Mill in the reading, even though I didn't have a spot for him up here in the table. Mill believed in individual freedom, but he wanted the government to step in when it was supposed to improve the hard lives of the working class. What is socialism? I know a lot of you guys have heard of socialism before. It's been part of the political discourse in America for, 15 years anyway. So if you've heard anything on TV from any president or senator or congressman or anything, you've probably heard someone mention socialism and their idea of it. But really, socialism defined is that the people as a whole own the means of production instead of a few private individuals. Okay? Now that's a pretty rosy picture of socialism, but it's a simple one. Of course, that, there's a lot that comes with that. There are a lot of opinions on whether or not this is a good thing or a bad thing, but the simple definition is when everybody owns the factories instead of just a few people. This brings us to question 6. What are the means of production? It's defined in the reading here, and it's basically defined as businesses that create and distribute goods. The example I give here is a factory. Okay? Factories, mines, railroads, oil wells, basically the things that create goods, create services. Those are the means of production. The things that make stuff people want are the means of production. And according to the communists, the things that make stuff that people want should be controlled by the people who want the stuff, okay? Not just a few individuals. And what did Karl Marx predict? He predicted a violent struggle between the factory owners and the factory workers. Okay? He predicted a struggle between the people who own the means of production, the bourgeoisie, the people who work for them, the proletariat. We just talked about how nationalism caused Marxism to lose appeal. People felt more loyalty, they felt stronger ties to their countries than to the international communist movement. And Karl Marx said, workers of the world unite, and the world said, nah, we're going to unite with our own countries. Bourgeoisie. Well, if we go into the reading up here, it talks about the haves had always owned the means of production. Okay. Oh, here we go. The haves were the bourgeoisie. The people who owned the stuff were the bourgeoisie. The people who worked with the stuff were the proletariat. Okay. Karl Marx predicted that workers would overtake the factories. Questions 11 and 12 were ones I really hope you guys tried to answer. But understanding how Ricardo and Malthus and Smith looked at the economy and poverty, and comparing that to how Owen and Marx looked at these things, it gives us a good idea of how they sought to solve the problem of poverty. Okay. Ricardo and Malthus said, if you want to solve poverty, you know, poor people need to solve their own poverty by having fewer children, by living thrifty and working hard. And Owen and Marx said, well, it's easy. Just take some of the money from the people who have it and give it to the people who don't, right? Share the wealth equally. Okay. And that would make it so that nobody was poor. Okay. Because remember in kindergarten where some kids would come to school with the Crayola crayons, the box of 64 crayons, and other kids would come to school with one little box of the something art, crazy art or whatever crayons, the cheap ones, and they would all end up mixed up in the same tub. That's sort of a communist or socialist view of how to share crayons, so that nobody had crappy crayons and nobody had awesome crayons. They were all shared alike. But that's the different ways that people would solve the problem. You know, Malthus or Ricardo, they might say, well, if people don't want cruddy crayons, then they should, you know, save their money better, or they shouldn't have kids if they can't afford nice crayons. Compare laissez-faire with socialism. Laissez-faire is an economic system where people can operate without interference and look after their own good. So people can take care of themselves in laissez-faire. But in laissez-faire, people are often winners and losers. They end up either rich or poor. It doesn't necessarily take a role when it comes to who is happy and who is not. It's the government not getting in the way of people being really happy or really miserable. Socialism, on the other hand, socialism is an economic system where people share the goods and services that are produced by themselves. So if, you know, under a socialist farm, if we grow the food, we get the food. But in socialism, people aren't as free to make their own choices. You know, they're not allowed to make selfish choices. They're not allowed to make choices that look after their own good. And as it was practiced, you know, in communism, it didn't actually happen. People didn't share very well. So in socialism, the idea is everybody shares everything, but and that worked somewhat in Robert Owen's New Lanark, but in communist Russia, it just ended up that instead of everybody being medium and no one rich or poor, it was just almost everyone was poor, and a few people at the top, you know, had, you know, gold-plated shotguns and very expensive cigars, and were very wealthy, sort of stuff. So that's kind of the difference between these two economic systems. Did anyone have any questions about this reading? No. Okay. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to post my answer key here. I'm going to go ahead and post this as a document, what do we call it, as a material on Google Classroom, and you guys can use it, but I'm going to take it down before we do the quiz. So if you want this, you better copy it into your own notes. Okay.